Okay, so have you ever had that moment where you're like really trying to get your head around business risk?
Uh-huh.
Like, just grappling with it all,
Right.
trying to make a judgment call on, are these new security investments really going to make a difference?
Right.
Sometimes it feels like you're just drowning in a sea of data, reports and spreadsheets,
Yeah, totally get that.
not really seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, you can't quite get that big picture strategic view.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to try to do just that, cut through all the noise, and really dig into a really fundamental concept in business: risk tolerance.
Yes.
And to help us navigate this complex topic, we're going to be turning to the insights of Peter Gaudet from ManageXValue.com.
Okay, yeah.
Now, what I really appreciate about Peter's work, and what I think aligns so perfectly with what we aim to do here, is his mission to make quantitative analysis more accessible.
Hmm.
That kind of analysis that underpins solid business decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find so interesting about his work is that he really takes these sometimes very abstract ideas around risk and turns them into something that companies can actually use when
Right.
they're, making strategic decisions.
Right.
It's all about figuring out that sweet spot. How much risk are we actually okay with as an organization?
And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this deep dive today. We're exploring the concept of risk tolerance from a business perspective.
Okay.
We're going to be drawing from a video that Peter published recently, as
Yep.
well as his accompanying notes.
Got it.
And we'll be looking at it from a variety of viewpoints,
Hmm.
thinking about how everyone in a company, from the board of directors to the management team
Yeah.
to regulators even, and of course those on the front lines, the risk management teams, how all these different perspectives come into play.
Right. And I think if we just take a step back for a second and look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
it becomes really clear how important this is. Having a good grasp of risk tolerance, it's not just some theoretical exercise,
Right.
It has a direct impact.
Right
It
on.
shapes the most important decisions a company makes, where to invest resources,
Right.
especially in areas like the security.
Exactly. And that brings us to the two main things we're going to be tackling today. So first things first, we need to get crystal clear on what exactly we mean by risk tolerance in a business context.
Okay.
And then second, we're going to look at how that understanding directly feeds into decisions about investments,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when we start factoring in this idea of diminishing returns. We often see this with things like security spending.
Right.
So the goal is to go beyond just a surface level understanding of risk,
Yeah.
move beyond that to a place where we can think about it more strategically.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's jump right in. When we talk about risk tolerance in a business, what are we really talking about?
Well, the work that Peter Gaudet does, he really emphasizes the role of the board of directors in setting this risk tolerance. And one of the tools they can use to define it is something called the loss exceedance curve.
The loss exceedance curve, okay?
Yeah, so think of it this way. It's basically a visual representation.
Okay.
It helps you see how likely it is that your company will experience annual financial losses that exceed certain amounts.
So I'm picturing like a graph,
Yeah.
where you could see, for example, there's a 5% chance we might lose more than $5 million in a year, and, a 15% chance we might lose more than $1 million, and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. And using this curve, the board can say, we are comfortable with no more than, let's say, a 5% chance of annual losses exceeding $5 million.
Right.
That point on the curve essentially becomes their defined risk tolerance threshold. It's the level of potential loss and the probability of it happening that they're willing to accept.
I see. So it's like that point on the graph becomes their line in the sand.
Yeah, exactly. And then from there, it's the responsibility of the risk management team to figure out the strategies to bring the actual likelihood of losses below that point.
So that gives them, a really clear target to aim for.
Right.
Now, Peter also makes this really important distinction between what he calls absolute and relative risk tolerance.
Yes.
So can you break down the difference for us and why it matters so much?
Sure. So this is where things get really interesting, I think. And it can actually change the way you think about risk.
Okay.
Looking at the absolute dollar amount of potential losses, that's certainly one way to do it. You see a big number and it catches your attention.
For sure. If a company's looking at a potential $10 million loss, that sounds pretty serious.
Absolutely.
Right.
In isolation, it is a significant number. But the key point that Peter makes is that you also have to look at risk in relation to the size of the organization.
Okay.
And the benchmark he uses is market capitalization. So that's basically the total value of all the company's outstanding shares.
Right.
And he illustrates this really well in his YouTube video.
Okay.
He uses this hypothetical business as an example. And they've determined that the overall expected risk of loss in a year is about 2.8% of their market cap.
So instead of just saying, oh, we could lose $10 million, they're saying that $10 million represents 2.8% of the total value of our company.
Exactly.
And that really does give you a different perspective on the scale of that risk, doesn't it?
It really does. And in the video, they go on to show how the management team in this example, they set a pretty aggressive risk tolerance.
Aggressive meaning.
Meaning low. They said they were only comfortable with a 45% likelihood of annual losses exceeding just 0.5% of their market capitalization.
Wow. Okay. So 0.5%, that's something they really, really want to avoid any big losses.
They do. And the point that Gide makes here is that setting such a low risk tolerance, it has a direct consequence.
Which is?
It requires a lot of effort, a lot of investment in risk mitigation.
And that makes sense, right? If you're not willing to accept much risk at all, you're going to have to invest more to prevent those losses.
Precisely. And that takes us nicely to our next point, the connection between risk tolerance and funding.
Right, because if a company's saying, look, we're only okay with a tiny amount of risk, it stands to reason that they'd need to be prepared to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, exactly.
Invest more in things like, security measures and other risk reduction activities.
And this is a key takeaway, I think, for everyone involved. From the top leadership down to the risk management teams.
Yeah, for sure.
If the board or, senior management, if they're mandating a very low risk tolerance, well, the teams responsible for managing risk, they need to be given the resources to make that happen.
Right. It can't just be lip service, right?
Exactly. It's not enough to say we want minimal risk.
Right.
You actually have to allocate the budget to make it a reality. You need to be able to invest in things that will bring that loss exceedance curve down to the desired level.
So if you're a risk manager
Yeah.
and you're being told, okay, we need to operate within a very tight risk tolerance.
Yeah.
You need to be ready to ask some tough questions about resources.
Absolutely. You've got to make sure you have the tools to do the job.
And when we talk about those decisions about where to allocate resources, Peter brings in another really valuable concept, excess value probability.
Yes.
So how does that factor into deciding where to put those limited resources?
Right. So excess value probability, it's basically a way of evaluating whether in investment in risk mitigation, whether it's actually worth it.
Okay.
You're looking at, will the benefit we get, the reduction in potential financial loss, will that outweigh the cost of making that investment and maintaining it?
So it's like a cost-benefit analysis, but specifically focused on reducing risk.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. You're trying to determine the return on investment for your risk mitigation efforts.
Makes sense.
And generally, investments that have a high excess value probability, where the decrease in potential losses is significantly bigger than the cost of implementing those security measures, those are much easier to get approved.
Right, because it's a clear win.
It is. You're essentially saying, we're going to spend this amount, and in return, we're significantly reducing the chance of a much larger loss.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, now this leads us to an idea that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. Diminishing returns in security investments. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, this is a really crucial concept, especially when you're aiming for that very low risk tolerance that we've been talking about.
Okay.
The basic idea of diminishing returns is that as you invest more and more in security, the added benefit you get from each additional investment tends to go down.
Okay, so it's not a one-to-one relationship.
It's not linear.
So let me see if I understand this. So let's say we install a really good firewall, and that significantly improves our security.
Okay.
If we then go and install a second firewall, does that make us twice as secure?
Not necessarily, no. And often not at all, in a simple additive way.
I see.
So what Peter explains is that usually your first security investments, they're going after the most obvious vulnerabilities.
The low-hanging fruit.
Exactly, those easy targets. And those initial measures, they have the biggest impact on your overall security.
So it's like that first really strong lock you put on your front door, right? That makes a huge difference.
Right.
But then adding a second deadbolt and a chain, sure, it adds some extra security, but the benefit of each additional lock is less than that first one.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And once you've addressed those major risks, the really obvious ones, the next round of investments, they're often targeting more specific or less likely threats.
Okay.
And while those might still be important, maybe for compliance reasons or to protect against very particular threats, they don't have as much of an impact on reducing your overall risk.
The bang for your buck goes down.
It does, yeah.
And this all ties back into the challenge of trying to reach a really, really low risk tolerance, doesn't it?
It does, because it's not just about the increasing cost of implementing all these security controls. It's also about the fact that each additional investment becomes less effective at reducing your overall risk exposure.
You're getting less and less return for your investment.
Exactly. And Gaday's point is that those initial security investments, the ones that are well chosen, they achieve the bulk of the risk reduction.
Okay.
So if an organization's pushing for a super low risk tolerance, they're going to end up having to make more and more investments that have a smaller and smaller impact.
They're chasing diminishing returns.
They are, and that can get really expensive and inefficient. You might end up spending a fortune for just a tiny improvement in security.
Right. Okay, so let's just take a minute to recap what we've covered here.
Sure.
We started by looking at how a board of directors can define risk tolerance. We even talked about a visual tool. They can use the loss exceedance curve.
Right.
And then we talked about that really crucial distinction between absolute risk, the dollar figure, and relative risk, thinking about it in relation to something like market capitalization.
Yep, and how that relative view can actually give you a much better understanding of the true impact of those potential losses.
Exactly. We also highlighted how setting a really low risk tolerance, a really aggressive one, means you have to commit the resources to back it up.
Absolutely. You can't just wish for low risk. You have to invest in it.
Right. And then we dug into how companies can evaluate those potential investments using the concept of excess value probability.
Right. Essentially asking, is this investment going to reduce our risk enough to justify the cost?
Exactly. And finally, we tackled that really interesting concept of diminishing returns in security investments, how that can make achieving an extremely low risk tolerance much harder and potentially not the best use of resources.
And I think the big takeaway for our listeners is that understanding all of these dynamics, it gives you a much more sophisticated and strategic way to think about risk management.
Yeah.
It's not just about ticking boxes and implementing security measures.
Yeah, it's about the big picture.
It's about having those deeper conversations, about how much risk are we really willing to accept, and how can we be smart about allocating our resources to manage that risk in a way that makes financial sense.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, here's a final thought for you to consider. Given that we know there are diminishing returns on security investments, how should organizations find that balance between their desired risk tolerance and their overall investment strategy?
Right.
How can they achieve a level of security that's both effective and financially sound without falling into that trap of spending a ton of money for very little gain?
Right.
And, it's not just about cybersecurity. Think about how this applies to other areas of business risk management as well. Or even think about it on a personal level. How do you weigh potential risks against the cost of mitigating them in your own life?
Yeah.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, that smart strategic balance.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us today.
That's you.